Before we start, imagine discovering that the person you've been disrespecting for years is actually a certified legend. Like presidential handshake, classified operations, saved thousands of lives type legend. That's what happened to Marcus Morrison, a cocky Silicon Valley exec who thought his father-in-law was just a nobody janitor. Spoiler alert. Ray Morrison had a past so classified, even mentioning his name made Pentagon contractors go pale. But here's where it gets wild. When Marcus finally learned the truth, it was already too late. Dangerous people from Ray's past were closing in. This story will completely change how you see the ordinary people around you. And if you've ever judged someone by their job title or bank account, you need to hear this. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't come around often. Stick with me until the end, because the twist that happens in Act 3? Absolutely jaw-dropping. Let's get into it. Marcus Morrison had built an empire in Silicon Valley by reading people like code, identifying their weaknesses, exploiting their blind spots, maximizing their value. On the night of November 23rd, he would use that same ruthless precision to shatter the one man who had sacrificed everything for the woman he loved. And the worst part? Marcus had absolutely no idea what he was about to destroy. The boardroom at Nexus Tech gleamed like a temple to ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the San Francisco skyline, each light below representing someone grinding, hustling, clawing their way toward relevance. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his Tom Ford suit sharp enough to cut glass, closing a $12 million acquisition deal with the kind of effortless confidence that made investors feel like they were betting on a sure thing. When he spoke, venture capitalists leaned forward. When he smiled, competitors went pale. At 34, Marcus Morrison was exactly who he'd always wanted to be. Powerful, wealthy, untouchable. He had the corner office, the Tesla in the parking garage, the beautiful wife who looked perfect in photos. He had everything except respect for the people who didn't measure up to his standards. And at the very top of that list was his father-in-law, Ray. The video call came during Marcus's lunch break, interrupting his scroll through LinkedIn endorsements. Sarah's face filled his screen, that familiar mix of hope and exhaustion in her eyes. Behind her, Marcus could see the dated wallpaper of her childhood home. Floral patterns that screamed 1990-something. The kind of decor that made Marcus's skin crawl. Then Ray appeared in the frame, waving with that gentle, unassuming smile that somehow made Marcus feel even more contempt. Ray Morrison wore a maintenance uniform with his name stitched over the pocket, his hands still bearing the calluses of manual labor, talking about his shift at Lincoln High School like it was something to be proud of. A broken boiler, flooded bathrooms, kids who'd vandalized the gym. Ray spoke about these things with the same earnestness other men reserved for closing deals or launching startups. And Marcus could barely hide his disgust as he half listened, one eye on his phone, scrolling through emails that actually mattered. Sarah caught it, of course. She always did. That night, in their minimalist Palo Alto condo with its smart lighting and voice-activated everything, she confronted him with the kind of quiet fury that's somehow worse than screaming. "You can't even pretend to care about my father for 5 minutes," she said, her voice trembling. Marcus set down his whiskey, ready with the same defense he always used. "I'm not saying he's a bad guy, Sarah. I'm just saying we have a certain standard, an image to maintain. Your dad's a great person, but let's be honest, he's a janitor. When my colleagues ask what your father does, what am I supposed to say?" The look Sarah gave him could have frozen oceans. "You're supposed to say he's a good man. That's all you need to say." But Marcus didn't understand that. Good men were a dime a dozen in his world, Great men built companies, disrupted industries, made Forbes lists. Great men didn't push mops for minimum wage in small-town high schools. Thanksgiving arrived like an obligation Marcus couldn't algorithm his way out of. The drive from Silicon Valley to the small California town where Ray lived felt like time travel in reverse. Past the innovation centers and tech campuses, through suburban sprawl, into a place where people still knew their neighbors' names, and the biggest restaurant was an Applebee's. Ray's house sat on a quiet street, lined with modest homes, pickup trucks in driveways, American flags on porches. Marcus parked his Tesla like it was slumming, already dreading the next 48 hours. Inside, the house smelled like roasted turkey and generations of family dinners, every surface covered with photos of Sarah at various ages, school plays, soccer games, prom. Ray had set the table with mismatched plates and cloth napkins that had seen better decades, proud as if he were hosting the Last Supper. And maybe, in a way, he was. The dinner started civilly enough. Ray asked about Marcus's work with genuine interest, nodding along to descriptions of artificial intelligence and machine learning like he could actually follow it. Sarah's aunt and uncle made small talk. Potatoes were passed. Wine was poured. Then Ray made the mistake of offering wisdom. "You know what I've learned, Marcus?" Ray said, his weathered hands folding his napkin with military precision. "Success isn't about how high you climb. It's about being present for the people who matter. Being there when they need you. That's the real measure of a life well lived." The words hung in the air, like a challenge Marcus couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was weeks of pent-up frustration at being dragged to this forgettable town. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of a high school janitor presuming to lecture a tech executive about success. Whatever it was, Marcus felt something snap inside him. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Marcus's voice cut through the warm family atmosphere like a blade through silk. "That's the kind of thing people say when they've given up, Ray. When they've settled. I mean, you're clearly intelligent. You raised an incredible daughter. So what happened? Why did you never try for something better? Why did you just stop?" The table went silent. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. Her aunt suddenly found her wineglass fascinating. Ray's face remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something deeper, something that looked almost like pity for Marcus. "Some choices aren't about ambition," Ray said quietly. "Some choices are about love." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the small dining room. "Love? Come on. You're working as a janitor in the same town you grew up in. You could have been anything, done anything. Instead, you're cleaning up after teenagers for $8.50 an hour. If that's love, then love looks a lot like failure from where I'm sitting." Ray stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He didn't say a word. He simply folded his napkin, placed it beside his plate with the precision of a man who'd done everything in his life with precision, and walked out the back door into the November night. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. But they weren't sad tears. They were furious. "You have no idea," she whispered, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You have absolutely no idea what kind of man my father really is. Not even close." She stood and followed Ray outside, leaving Marcus alone at the table with her horrified relatives and his own toxic satisfaction. He'd won the argument. He'd made his point. He'd established the hierarchy. So why did victory taste like ashes in his mouth? That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. Guilt gnawed at him in the guest room with its quilted bedspread and walls covered in Sarah's childhood artwork. Around 2 a.m., he gave up and wandered through Ray's house, telling himself he was getting water, but really searching for something he couldn't name. In the garage, surrounded by neatly organized tools and labeled storage bins, Marcus found it. A framed photograph, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. The frame was expensive, the photo professionally taken. It showed a younger Ray, maybe 40, in a sharp suit, shaking hands with a former U.S. president at what was unmistakably a White House ceremony. Ray was smiling. But it wasn't the gentle smile Marcus knew. This smile belonged to someone important, someone powerful, someone who commanded rooms. Marcus stared at the photo, his mind racing. What was a high school janitor doing shaking hands with the President of the United States? What ceremony was this? Why was this photo hidden in a garage instead of displayed with pride? The questions burned through Marcus's skull as morning light crept through the garage windows. He heard movement in the house. Ray, always an early riser. Marcus quickly replaced the photo and headed back inside, his perception of reality beginning to crack like a windshield after a stone strike. At breakfast, Ray's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and stepped onto the back porch. Marcus moved to the kitchen window, ostensibly washing his coffee mug, but really watching, listening. And that's when he heard Ray speaking in rapid, flawless Mandarin, not tourist Mandarin, not language app Mandarin, but the fluid, sophisticated Mandarin of someone who'd spent years mastering every tonal nuance. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. Ray's body language was completely different. Straight-backed, alert, his voice carrying an authority Marcus had never heard before. When Ray came back inside, he was the gentle janitor again, asking if Marcus wanted more coffee. The transformation was seamless, terrifying. Marcus drove back to Silicon Valley that afternoon in silence. Sarah still barely speaking to him, his mind churning with questions he didn't know how to ask. Who was Ray Morrison? And what had Marcus just done? Here's the question that should be burning in your mind right now. What kind of past could transform a man from shaking hands with presidents to cleaning high school toilets? And would Marcus discover the truth before his arrogance destroyed the family he'd married into? Marcus Morrison made his fortune by solving puzzles that other people couldn't see. Algorithms hidden in chaos, patterns buried in data, opportunities disguised as obstacles. But the puzzle of Ray Morrison would nearly destroy him before he understood that some secrets are kept not out of shame, but out of love so profound it requires the sacrifice of everything you've ever been. And by the time Marcus started finding the pieces, dangerous people were already putting together puzzles of their own. The morning after Thanksgiving, Marcus sat in his corner office at Nexus Tech, staring at his computer screen without seeing it. His team was celebrating the successful close of a major acquisition, champagne flowing in the conference room. But Marcus couldn't stop seeing that photograph. Ray in that suit, shaking hands with a president, looking like someone who belonged in rooms where decisions affecting millions of lives were made. He opened a new browser tab and typed Ray Morrison Government into the search bar, then hesitated. What was he looking for? What was he afraid of finding? The cursor blinked at him like an accusation. Sarah hadn't spoken to him beyond logistical necessities since Thanksgiving dinner. She slept on the far edge of their bed, a continent of cold space between them, and Marcus knew he'd crossed a line he didn't fully understand. But he couldn't let it go. The mystery of Ray Morrison had lodged itself in his brain like malware, corrupting every other process, demanding resolution. The phone call on Ray's porch haunted him. That Mandarin had been flawless, not just fluent, but native-level sophisticated. Marcus had worked with enough international executives to know the difference between someone who'd taken language courses and someone who'd operated in those languages for years. And the way Ray had carried himself during that conversation, the authority in his voice, the way his entire demeanor had shifted. It was like watching someone drop a disguise they'd been wearing for so long, they'd almost forgotten it wasn't real. Who speaks Mandarin at that level while working as a high school janitor? Who has direct phone conversations at 6 a.m. that require that kind of linguistic precision? The questions multiplied in Marcus's mind like fractals, each answer spawning 10 new mysteries. He started searching, carefully at first, then obsessively. He ran Ray's name through every database he had access to, LinkedIn, professional networks, public records. Nothing. Ray Morrison existed only as a janitor who'd worked at Lincoln High for 15 years. A widower, a father. Before that, employment records went dark, as if Ray had simply materialized fully formed in that small California town with a 12-year-old daughter and no past worth mentioning. The tech conference in San Jose came 3 days later, one of those mandatory networking events where Marcus usually thrived. He worked the room with practiced ease, collecting business cards and LinkedIn connections like they were currency. But his mind was elsewhere. During a panel discussion on artificial intelligence and national security, Marcus found himself sitting next to an older man named Richard Chen, a former defense contractor who now consulted for private equity firms. They made small talk during the break, the usual Silicon Valley ritual of establishing pecking order through subtle, humble brags. Then Marcus, almost without thinking, dropped Ray's name into the conversation. My father-in-law used to do some government work. Ray Morrison. Ever run across that name in your defense days? Richard Chen's face went absolutely white. His hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. For 3 full seconds, the man who'd just been confidently discussing Pentagon contracts looked like he'd seen a ghost materialize in the convention center. The Ray Morrison? Chen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. From the Pentagon. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. I don't know. Maybe? What did he? Chen stood up abruptly, coffee forgotten. I can't talk about classified material, Morrison. But if that man is your father-in-law, you should probably treat him with a hell of a lot more respect than your tone suggests you do. He walked away before Marcus could respond, disappearing into the crowd of tech executives and leaving Marcus standing there with the sensation of the floor tilting beneath his feet. Pentagon, classified material, the Ray Morrison, spoken with the kind of reverence people usually reserved for legends. What had the gentle janitor who asked about Marcus's day and made terrible dad jokes at family dinners done that would make a hardened defense contractor go pale at the mention of his name? Marcus's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and started a new search. Ray Morrison, Pentagon, classified intelligence. The results were maddeningly vague. Heavily redacted documents, FOIA requests that led nowhere. News articles from the mid-2000s about successful counterterrorism operations with no names attached. But there were breadcrumbs, references to senior intelligence analysts and classified operations and prevented catastrophic attacks. Entire paragraphs blacked out, names removed. But the timeline matched. The locations, when they weren't redacted, matched places Marcus vaguely remembered Sarah mentioning from her childhood. Germany, Singapore, Virginia. They'd moved constantly, she'd once said, until her mother died, and they'd finally settled down. The obsession consumed him. Marcus found himself neglecting work, ignoring calls, spending hours down rabbit holes of declassified intelligence reports and congressional testimonies. His team started giving him concerned looks. His assistant asked if he was feeling well. Sarah noticed, of course. She caught him at 2 in the morning, surrounded by printouts of redacted CIA documents, his laptop screen glowing with archived news articles about the Intelligence Star, one of the agency's highest honors, awarded for voluntary acts of courage performed under hazardous conditions, and almost never publicly acknowledged. "What are you doing?" Sarah stood in the doorway of his home office, arms crossed, wearing the Stanford sweatshirt she'd had since college. Marcus looked up, exhausted, wired on coffee and adrenaline. "Your father. Tell me about your father." Sarah's expression shifted through several emotions: anger, pain, exhaustion, something that might have been relief. She walked into the office and sat down across from him, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, really looked at him. "What do you want to know?" Everything. Marcus wanted to know everything. And so Sarah told him. Ray Morrison had been one of the most brilliant intelligence analysts the CIA had ever produced. Starting in the late 90s, he'd specialized in counterterrorism, with particular expertise in Chinese intelligence operations and emerging terrorist networks. After September 11th, Ray's work became critical. He was part of the team that identified and helped dismantle cells planning follow-up attacks. He worked 20-hour days in secure facilities, connecting dots that other analysts missed, seeing patterns in the noise. He spoke 6 languages fluently. He'd briefed presidents and senators. He'd received commendations that would never be made public and prevented attacks that the American public would never know had been planned. The Intelligence Star he'd received was for an operation Sarah still didn't fully understand. Something involving a plot that would have killed thousands, dismantled because of Ray's analysis and his willingness to put himself in danger to verify intelligence. He had been untouchable, legendary, the kind of operative whose name got whispered in the halls of Langley with genuine awe. But there had been a cost. Sarah's mother, Linda, had paid it. Constant relocations, never staying anywhere long enough to build real friendships, security threats that meant living in a state of perpetual vigilance. The stress of knowing her husband might not come home from certain operations. And through it all, Ray had been gone, physically present when he could be, but mentally always in the next crisis, the next analysis, the next mission. Linda had endured it because she loved him, because she believed in what he was doing, because she understood that her husband was saving lives. Then came the cancer diagnosis. Sarah was 11. Linda was 43. The doctors said it was aggressive, possibly stress-related, definitely fatal. She had maybe 18 months. Ray requested leave. The CIA granted it, but the work never really stopped. Encrypted calls at odd hours, secure briefings he'd attend remotely, analysts who needed his expertise. Linda spent her final months in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers, with a husband who was trying desperately to be present, but kept getting pulled back into a world of classified crises. In her last week, lucid moments becoming rarer, Linda had made Ray promise her something. Sarah had been in the room, young enough to not fully understand, but old enough to never forget. "No more secrets," Linda had whispered, her hand gripping Ray's with surprising strength. "No more danger. Be there for Sarah. Just be there. That's all I'm asking. Be her father, not a hero. Promise me." Ray had wept. The only time Sarah had ever seen her father cry, and promised. 3 days later, Linda was gone, and 6 months after that, so was Ray's career. He walked away from everything. The 6-figure pension he was entitled to declined. The consulting offers from private security firms that would have made him wealthy, ignored. The colleagues who begged him to stay, to train the next generation, to at least remain available for the most critical situations, refused. Ray Morrison, one of the CIA's most valuable assets, chose his daughter instead. He moved them to Linda's hometown, that small California place Sarah barely remembered visiting as a child, and found a job as a night janitor at the local high school. The job wasn't random, Sarah explained, her voice thick with emotion Marcus had never heard before. Ray had chosen it specifically because the hours, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., meant he could be home every single day when Sarah got back from school. He could make her dinner, help with homework, attend every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every school play. For 6 years, Ray Morrison traded a career protecting millions of people for the chance to protect one girl who'd already lost too much. He gave up relevance for presence. He chose love over legacy. And he never told anyone because the work he'd done was classified, and because he'd never been the kind of man who needed recognition. Being there, Sarah said, was enough for him. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the weight of it crashed over him. Every condescending comment he'd made. Every time he dismissed Ray's simple life. Every moment of contempt for a man he'd judged by his job title instead of his character. He'd mocked a genuine hero for choosing his daughter over glory. He'd called sacrifice failure. He'd measured a legend by the yardstick of Silicon Valley status and found him wanting. When all along, Marcus himself had been the one found wanting. The apology came 2 days later. Marcus drove back to that small California town, showed up at Ray's door without calling ahead, and tried to put into words the shame and admiration and desperate need for forgiveness that was choking him. Ray listened on his modest front porch, the same gentle expression on his face. And when Marcus finished his stammering apology, Ray simply said, "You don't owe me anything, Marcus. I just hope you'll be there for Sarah the way I tried to be. That's all that matters." It should have been enough. It should have been the end of the story. The humbled son-in-law, the forgiving father, the family healing. But that night, as Marcus drove back to Silicon Valley with a lighter conscience and a profound new respect for Ray Morrison, he failed to notice the dark sedan that had been parked across from Ray's house for the past 3 days. He didn't see the two men inside, speaking in Russian-accented English, taking photos with telephoto lenses. He couldn't have known that Ray's past wasn't finished with him, that the work Ray had done 15 years ago was about to come back with lethal consequences, or that Sarah had left out one crucial detail. The FBI had been calling Ray for months, begging for his help with a new threat connected to his old cases. And Ray had been refusing. Because he'd made a promise to a dying woman. Because he'd chosen his family over his duty once before, and couldn't bring himself to choose differently now, even if lives hung in the balance. But here's what Marcus didn't know yet. What he wouldn't discover until it was almost too late. What happens when the secrets you've buried come digging themselves back up? And what price do you pay when the people you once stopped decide it's time for revenge? The question that kept Marcus Morrison awake wasn't whether he could protect his father-in-law. It was whether he deserved the chance to try. Because redemption, he was learning, doesn't come from apologies whispered on front porches. It comes from standing in the fire you once mocked others for walking through, and proving you understand what courage actually costs. The sign started small, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking. A car parked too long on Ray's quiet street, engine off, but someone always sitting in the driver's seat. Ray's mailbox tampered with, letters slightly disturbed, envelopes that looked like they'd been steamed open and carefully resealed. Then came the break-in that wasn't quite a break-in. Ray's garage door left unlocked, nothing stolen. But file boxes Marcus had seen neatly stacked now, sitting at slightly different angles. as if someone had been searching for something specific and tried to cover their tracks. Marcus noticed because he'd been visiting more, trying to build the relationship he should have valued all along, trying to learn from a man he'd spent years dismissing. And Ray, for his part, had been welcoming but increasingly distracted. His eyes tracking cars that passed too slowly, his body language shifting into that alert, military bearing Marcus had glimpsed during the Mandarin phone call. Something was wrong. The question was whether Ray would admit it before that something became dangerous. Sarah provided the missing piece over dinner at their Palo Alto condo, her voice quiet but firm, tired of keeping secrets that were becoming liabilities. The FBI had been contacting Ray for 7 months. A new threat had emerged, something connected to Ray's old counterterrorism work. Chinese intelligence networks he'd helped dismantle in the 2000s, specifically a handler named Chen Wei, who disappeared after Ray's analysis had burned an entire operation. Chen Wei had resurfaced, older now but still operational, and the intelligence community believed he was planning something significant on American soil. Ray's expertise was uniquely suited to understanding Chen Wei's methodology, his patterns, his likely targets. The FBI had begged Ray to consult, even remotely, even for just a few sessions. Ray had refused every request. He'd made a promise to Linda on her deathbed, and he wouldn't break it. Not even for national security, not even if lives hung in the balance. The past was closed. His duty was to Sarah now, and nothing would make him risk becoming that person again, the person who chose the mission over his family. But Chen Wei, Sarah explained with tears in her eyes, apparently remembered Ray Morrison very well. And he'd brought friends. Marcus started noticing them everywhere once he knew to look. The sedan that followed him from Ray's house back to the highway, staying exactly 3 cars back, professional enough to be alarming. The man in the coffee shop near Ray's home who seemed far too interested in his newspaper, his eyes tracking Ray through the window. The phone calls Ray received at odd hours that he'd step outside to take, returning with his jaw set and his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, Marcus realized, but from the effort of controlling rage he'd probably spent 15 years learning to suppress. These weren't amateur hour surveillance. These were professionals. And they wanted something from Ray Morrison badly enough to escalate from watching to intimidation. The question burning in Marcus's mind was simple. How long before watching became something worse? And what happened to Sarah if Marcus didn't act? The decision came to Marcus with the clarity that usually accompanied his best business insights. He'd built his fortune on understanding systems, on seeing patterns others missed, on leveraging technology to solve problems that seemed unsolvable. For years he'd dismissed Ray's world as obsolete, the relic of a pre-digital era when human intelligence mattered more than artificial intelligence. But now Marcus understood that the two worlds could intersect, that his skills and Ray's experience might be exactly what was needed. Not to drag Ray back into the life he'd left, but to protect him from the past that wouldn't let him go. Marcus reached out to his network, the cybersecurity experts who'd helped build Nexus Tech's infrastructure, the private investigators who'd vetted acquisition targets, even a former hacker he'd met at a conference who now ran a legitimate security consultancy. He explained the situation carefully, revealing only what was necessary, and within 48 hours had assembled a team capable of turning Ray's modest home into something significantly harder to breach. Cameras disguised as outdoor lights, digital surveillance to monitor the watchers, encrypted communication systems. Marcus spent $200,000 of his own money in 3 days. And when Ray found out, the older man's eyes filled with something that looked like pride. They became partners in a strange dance of protection and patience. Ray taught Marcus the fundamentals of operational awareness. How to spot a tail, how to vary your routes, how to think 3 moves ahead like chess, except the stakes were infinitely higher. Marcus brought technical solutions Ray had never imagined, tracking the operatives digitally, identifying their communication patterns, building a profile of their movements and objectives. It was bonding through necessity at first, but it became something deeper, a mutual respect born from finally understanding what the other person brought to the table. And for the first time in his life, Marcus understood that intelligence wasn't just about quarterly earnings and market disruption. Sometimes intelligence meant protecting the people you loved, using every advantage you possessed, even if no one would ever know you'd done it. The endgame came on a Tuesday evening when Sarah was visiting her father, making dinner in the kitchen where she'd grown up. The operatives made their move, 2 men approaching the house with purpose, one picking the lock with professional speed while the other watched the street. But Marcus's cameras caught them. The alarm system he'd installed alerted both men simultaneously. And Ray, moving with the muscle memory of a man who'd trained for situations exactly like this decades ago, intercepted them at the door with Marcus backing him up, phones recording everything, voices firm and unafraid. The operatives retreated, but not before Marcus's systems captured their faces, their vehicle information, their patterns of communication. It was enough. The evidence went to the FBI that night, delivered by Marcus personally to the agent who'd been trying to reach Ray for months. Within 72 hours, the operation was neutralized, arrests made, and Chen Wei's network dismantled for the second time in 20 years. The FBI asked Ray one final time to consult, to provide context on Chen Wei's psychology, to help them understand the full scope of the threat. And this time, with Marcus sitting beside him at a secure laptop connection, with Sarah's blessing, Ray agreed to limited remote consultation. He provided what was needed to protect innocent lives. But he did it from his living room, with his daughter cooking in the kitchen and his son-in-law finally understanding what strength actually looked like. The last Sunday of December found Marcus at Ray's dining table, helping set out mismatched plates for a family dinner, asking questions about Linda and listening to stories about a woman who'd loved a hero enough to let him go. Ray spoke about her with the kind of tenderness that comes from grief fully processed. And Marcus finally understood that the simple life Ray had chosen wasn't simple at all. It was the most complicated thing a man could do. Choosing presence over glory, choosing love over legacy, choosing to be there even when the world kept calling you back to greatness. In the background, the framed photo of Ray and the president hung where it belonged now, not hidden in a garage, but displayed in the living room. A reminder that heroism comes in many forms. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away from everything that made you legendary to be present for the one person who needed you most. So here's my question for you. When was the last time you really looked at the people around you and asked not what they've achieved, but what they've sacrificed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know about the unsung heroes in your life, the people whose quiet strength you might have overlooked. And if this story hit different, smash that like button and subscribe, because next week, we're diving into the story of a billionaire who discovered his cleaning lady was actually royalty in hiding. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.